Haere maera, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ina iwi ndui tonu rā, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Nau mai, nau mai, nau mai. Ki tēnei o tēnei whakāturanga tuawhā o te mahi e pāne ki tērā nāngara COVID-19. Nōku anō te hononga, ko kahui tēnei no Waikato Maniapoto, ki te whakahaere tēnei wā i te taha o ngā marae kura kua taimai i tēnei ata. Ana ko tōku tino rangatira, ko hera i e tērā i te mahi o ta rangahau e arahi ana i ahau i te wā i pēpi ana. Tai no ki tēnei wā, ko i e tērā no Ngāti Hauiti Te iwi rā, nau mahara mai, hera me o pukenga katoa e pāna ki nā kōrero katoa e pāna ki te ao Māori, ki akia ki tēnei kaupapa. Me tōku whangaunga anō ko kia koe te Kaz, whangaunga tata kia hau mai i tō tāne, tērā no Ngāti Maniapoto, tērā hoki i te moana o Te Wai Pounamu, e roa te wā e mahi ana i tēnei kaupapa ki te aki te whai oranga mō nai tāua, nai tātou te iwi Māori. So it's my pleasure and honour once again to be the facilitator of a webinar that we've been working with these wonderful marae kura that have turned up today to share their mōhiotanga. And they're well known to me because they've nurtured me in this journey of whai oranga for our people, and they've been major contributors to our publications, which are going to talk about their contribution to the Tōku Ara Rā COVID-19 Aotearoa 2020. So without too much, I'll hand it over first to my prestigious and well-known researcher, and has guided me, as I said, in my come as experienced and knowledgeable as she is, and it's Dr. Heather Gifford from Ngāti Hauiti, who will share her kōrero first and then followed on by Kaz. Nō reira, e te marae kura nau mahara mai. Thank you, Heather.
Nā mihi kia koutou katoa. I did actually want to start with a mihi to a few people, and first off to Kahu and Te Wai Ora. Kahu, thank you for you're a machine, man. You pulled us all together at the end of COVID. We asked us to write about our experiences, and that was amazing. And what we have in a very short period of time is an amazing publication that talks to the heart, I think, and the heads and the minds and all of those other things of all of the wonderful stories and journeys from around the motu. So, Kahu, big mihi to you for that. Thank you. Major contribution. I want to also acknowledge Amohia Bolton, who is a friend, first off, my work colleague, and the co-director, and the co-author of the paper that I'm talking about today, but she's also the current director of Whakauai. Kia ora to our other speaker, Kasna Luke from Ngaitahu. Lovely to have you with us as well, Kasna. And kia ora to everyone joining the webinar. I must admit, this is the first time I've ever done a webinar, so I'm a bit of a newbie in this new technology. And I have no idea how many people are out there. Maybe there might just be us that we're talking to ourselves, but kia ora everyone if you are out there. Ko waio, ko Heather Gifford tōku ingoa, he uri hau o Ngāti Hauiti me Ātiho Nui a Paparangi, so from the Rangatike and from Whanganui. And I thought I'd just start with a few hats that I'm wearing today, because it's always useful to declare your hats as an iwi leader. So I'm a senior, so I was the founder and director of Whakauai for 11 years, but moved about 5 years ago, moved to try and retire. But there's things that keep me really excited about this space, really. So I'm 68 and I'm sort of thinking, I might be around for another decade contributing in this space, but I'm very much a reduced role in terms of just supporting whakauai, supporting the mahi that we do. I'm also the Ngāti Hauiti delegate to the Mana Whenua board for our Whanganui District Health Board, and so I have quite a lot to do with the health sector, in particular our local BHB. And I've just been appointed as our chair for Te Runanga o Ngāti Hauiti. So I've been involved for about the last 20 years in iwi development, so it's a real privilege to be able to chair the runanga after a bit of doing my time in other ways. So I'm keeping an eye on the time really, and I think I've got about 20 or 25 minutes to talk about what I want to talk about today. So I wanted to highlight two things from the paper. I want to talk about really what we observed as we were part of a much wider iwi collective. And I want to talk about that observation around iwi leadership that happened during the Rahui. So I'm only talking about that period March to June 2020. And also I want to talk about the reflections, what that meant for us as researchers and iwi leaders in that space. I do encourage you to read the paper. If there is anyone out there that is listening to this, do read our paper, but also all of the other examples of wonderful leadership that happened for Māori over the COVID period. How I'm going to do this, I do need to look briefly at my notes, so do excuse me if I sort of move from engaging with you and looking at my notes, but I also want to take some short reflection time, stopping just for sort of 30 to 60 seconds to ask some questions of the audience as well. So I wanted to start really by providing some context and some concrete examples of who was involved in our story and what we did, and then move on to our reflections around leadership. So Ngāti Hauiti, which is one of my iwi on the Rangatike side, occupies the lower reaches of the Rangatike, so just north of Bulls and south of Taihape. So all of you driving through State Highway 1 will be going through our rohi. So, give us a bit of a mihi as you go through. We are most of the way through our claims process, which we've been doing for the last 15 years, and hope to be out the other side in the next 2 years. We also have, so we're a small iwi, really small iwi. Last count, about 3,500 people. So compared with our larger whanaunga of Naito and others, we're small, but I reckon we do a great job in terms of punching above our weight. We have a number of iwi entities included in our group Hauiti. So we have a strong environmental arm, we have some social services, we contract some health services from our local neighbouring iwi Ngāti Apa, and we have a research centre, so Whakauai Research, which is the only iwi-owned Māori Health Research Centre in Aotearoa that is funded independently, so soft-funded basically. We're as good as our last grant, and so we've managed to be in this space for the last 18 years and have worked hard and I think made a bit of a name and mark for ourselves in terms of not only taking care of our own research and Māori development needs locally, but thinking about across the motu, what can we contribute to Māori development? We are part of a larger grouping of 3 other iwi in the north, in the Taihape region, so Ngāi Tohuaki, Ngāti Whitikaupeku and Ngāti Tamakōpere, and so all together we make up the Mokai Pātia iwi tonu. And we collectively come together for things such as claims, some environmental work, some of our health and social service mahi, and of course our own development as iwi. So Mokai Pātea and the 4 iwi chairs that make up that are also part of a larger iwi collective called Te Rangatupua. So that includes iwi from South Taranaki, Wanganui, Waimareno, Taumaranui and the Rangatike. So that's a much larger collaboration. And we came together really when we started to attend National Iwi Chairs Forum, and we thought we need to be collectively thinking about what our positions are on various issues before we go out even further. And of course, Te Rangatupua chairs are all part of the National Iwi Chairs Forum. So there's this, for me, it feels like a huge family. You know, the whakapapa goes from, you know, very micro level to macro level, and we're part of all of that system, and I feel hugely proud to be part of that system. So I just wanted to think about then what were some of the concrete things, you know, so we can get a sense of what we did during that Rahui period. So locally at Hauiti, we formed the Hauiti COVID Leads group, which I was chairing. And so largely that was, for those that weren't actually directly involved, the amount of information was like a tsunami. It was just amazing. Like, we were meeting every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day in different rōpū. And the amount of information that we were having to process and think about, make decisions on, and then act on was just phenomenal. And over that 3-month period, I must admit, I saw some people looking pretty haggard by the end of it. It was huge, huge voluntary commitment by our iwi leaders. So we were part of that at a very local level. So that group included some of our whānau that were living locally, so we kept an ear and eye on the ground. It included our managers and directors of each of our entities, and then it included a group from the Runanga. And our whole purpose was to respond to the information that was coming through and make some decisions that were specifically about Hauiti, but also to think about, well, what are we thinking ourselves independently? So we did things like we rewrote our annual management plan to take into account COVID for the next 24 months. And we shifted our priorities in terms of thinking, well, if this is going to be around for a while, we need to be really smart about this. And what else, what needs to go, what needs to be added, and how are we preparing and looking after our people for the next, you know, the short term. So we did that. We also, so then also we were part of the regional Te Rangatupua collective response. And that was like scaling up what we were doing locally. So that Te Rangatupua set up an 0800 number, and we had a localised hub. We set up COVID testing stations. We provided emergency housing for whānau returning from overseas. We distributed resources to whānau. We had a dedicated comms team, and we were producing some of our own health promotion messages, such as whānau checks. We were spearheading the flu vaccine and hand hygiene initiatives around our region. There was phone support for our kaumātua and kuia. We managed some road closure stuff. We did some advocacy, and as well as that, we were part of the local emergency response team, which included local government, health, police, and civil defence. So a huge amount of work to gear all of that up across that Te Rangatupua region. Now, this is one of my pauses. I want us all to take a moment to reflect on how you and your whānau or your iwi were showing leadership during that time, because we weren't the only ones. And I want you to quietly, or however you want to do it, give a bit of a mihi to your own about the leadership that happened during that time. I now want to move to thinking more about the qualities of the leadership we saw during that time. And I want to, you know, I really want to emphasise and tautoko the huge effort and voluntary commitment. This wasn't people's usual day jobs. I don't know what happened to day jobs. Like, I'm lucky. My whakauā released me to go off and be chair the COVID response team. But I think other people were trying to manage jobs and all of their other usual commitments as well. So big ups to them, really. So we've got 7 points that we think were different about our response as iwi, because everyone was doing this. The whole country was mobilised. We weren't doing anything particularly that other people weren't doing. We were, everyone was doing the comms, everyone was doing the decision making, everyone was doing the responses. But as iwi, there were 7 things that made us different. Our response was based on tikanga. So kaitiakitanga, manakitanga, rangatiratanga, whakapapa. Those were the things that drove us. We had a shared vision. There was such an agreement as a collective about our longer term commitment to intergenerational flourishing. That's where our eye was, like decades and years ahead, generations ahead. That's what we were thinking about. This wasn't just a health issue for us. We really had a holistic view, I think, and I think a very good idea about our lived realities as Māori. And for that reason, we were aware of some things that the government hadn't even thought about. In particular, like I think it was into day 2 of the Rahui, and we were all talking about, well, what's going to happen with our whānau that might be really vulnerable in a lockdown situation in terms of family harm, alcohol consumption, all of those things. Where is the additional supports that are usually there for those whānau? Sorry, I'm going to have to take that phone off the hook. Phew. Somebody grabbed it. So we were able to sort of alert up to iwi chairs who were meeting with central government and meeting with the cabinet, and say, hey, you guys, you need to get this on the agenda. We have to have a total cross-government response. MSD has to get involved in this. We need to be aware and ahead of the game on this stuff. Things like, what would having the bubbles mean for some of our more isolated communities, particularly our really vulnerable communities up in our rural areas where we know that they're a lot older, they've got some comorbidities happening. How are we going to continue to support them at the same time as keeping them safe from the virus, really? So I think that lived realities, holistic view thing was really different. I think the level of advocacy demonstrated by iwi leaders was amazing, far and beyond anything else that we saw, really. And that, I mean, there was just numerous examples of that, but I'm just thinking about iwi chairs. Things like the National Māori Pandemic Response Group was set up like the first week of the Rahui by iwi chairs. They came up with various whānau-centric models for managing COVID that were different and complementary to, but different from, the usual government response. The other thing that really impressed me over that time was things like how quickly we responded as advocates to the change in legislation and policy. Like, we were doing legislation and policy off the hoof. Mm. We had, I remember one email that was sent, I think it was Mike Smith or somebody had sent it and said, we're just about to go into cabinet. This is what's up for grabs. Can you tell, this is the change in legislation, can you give us some quick feedback on what you think we need to be saying? So it was impressive. I think decisive, independent, Māori controlled initiatives was the other thing, things like our road closures. And we closed several of our roads in our region. And I think that happened totally differently from anywhere else in the country. And I think the other thing, the last point is really number 7, really, which is I think our responses were informed by Indigenous knowledge, by our mātauranga, And I want to give a big ups to people like Che Wilson and Gerard Albert, who belong to us in Te Tupua, but have a huge national influence in terms of making us think much more deeply about our tikanga during that period and what that meant to us, and were just absolute gems in terms of helping us to get through that using mātauranga. And of course, it wasn't only that, we also had Māori Public Health Intelligence, which was, they set up, the Māori Public Health Docs set up another whole independent advice group to government. And were keeping us updated, like on a weekly basis, with modelling that looked at, like, if this goes community, if we get a community outbreak, this is how many Māori will die. So that level of information was really phenomenal. So this is another pause break. I want you to think about examples of this sort of leadership and the qualities that I've talked about that you experienced or were part of during the Rahui. Okay, I want to move on to the role of research in this period, and in particular at iwi-owned research responses. And I want to just remind people about whakaua research. So basically we set up, I think it's 15 years ago in 2005, and set up with just two of us, started it. I started it as part of a postdoc from the HRC, thank you to the HRC, and it was the first ever HRC funding that ever was directly given to iwi to manage, you know, without a university involved. And we had big dreams and thought, oh, you know, this is, we can do this. I think it was, and it's been one of the most exciting things to be part of, really. And it's a huge privilege, really. And I think when I think about what has been of most value, really, I think it's the flexibility to be able to respond as an independent iwi-based research centre. I think the team that we have had around us, which has been a very solid team of local iwi members and people from here, and that's been a real value. I think also the contribution we make to iwi development. Sometimes, you know, it's not always fantastic. You know, sometimes I get blank looks from the runanga and they go, oh God, here she goes again, you know, sort of they don't quite get sometimes some of the points that I'm talking about. But I think what we really bring that I think they do value is our training and our skills as academics. And so largely that is things like being able to read a lot of information, think about it a lot, translate it if you like, and think about the implications for Māori. And that's really, I mean, we just do that in a very systematic way, that, you know, and that's our background and training. And I think that's incredibly useful for iwi. So what we did, so what Amu and I did really during the Rahui is that, as I said, we basically processed information. Oh, there goes that phone again. We critiqued information, we summarised it, and we fed back to the iwi what the implications would be for this particular issue. But sometimes it was also about thinking about, so sometimes we don't just take other people's information. Sometimes we create information ourselves. And so one of the things that happened towards the end of the Rahui was that our Te Tupua iwi chairs group said, look, there's some things we've learnt in this that we don't want to lose. Particularly, we'd really like to think more about a shared services model going forward and what that might look like across multiple iwi. And we need you to come up with an outcomes framework. And thank goodness it wasn't my job, it was Amohia's job as the technician. And so, so they said, no, we don't want anyone else's outcome measures. We actually want our own. So, you know, here is, and they gave us a high level, it was very, very high level tikanga-based principles, I guess. And then from that, we had to develop, well, Amohia and the technical team had to develop up an outcomes framework. So in conclusion, and I'm not doing too bad, it's 22 minutes. So what we've learnt during this period of development, I think we mobilised in a way we'd never done previously as iwi. It was really, really impressive. I was so proud. It was rapid, it was intelligent, it was effective, and it was really cohesive. And I hadn't seen anything like that before. We're taking the learning from the Rahui period and as Te Rangatupua, thinking about what we want to keep and further develop. And I've said things like the shared services model, but also our own governance models. What else do we need to do to manage into the future, to flourish into the future, really? What have we learned and what do we want to keep? But also Te Rangatupua are part of our regional recovery model for this region. And the exciting thing about that is that we're talking about social governance and equity as the key drivers of the recovery model. So that's a collective of 3 local government centres, regions. It's cross iwi, those iwi groups I've talked about, and it's also broad cross-sector governance. So it's education, justice, health, social services are all sitting at the table thinking about our local recovery and what does that look like going forward. And more broadly, across Aotearoa, Māori, there were some really interesting interviews at the end of the Rahui period with some Māori leaders who were reflecting back on what does Māori leadership look like post the lockdown, and what did we learn? And there were 3 things largely. Māori want and need and have the capacity to be in the driver's seat. We're sick of, being somewhere else and just looking in. We're ready to be at the decision-making table with government and industry. And Māori leadership should be a shared leadership model, not all of that load sitting on a few shoulders, but how can we really do a distributive leadership model? And I've got the last pause question here. I want you to take a minute now to think about what you want for Māori leadership in the future and what we've learnt and what you see as important. So in conclusion, let's not slip back to business as usual. I think it's really tempting to do that. I want us to use what we've learned and more importantly, what we've achieved over the Rahui, and think about the things that we want to take forward to ensure that we all have flourishing futures. Ngā mihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Heather. Before I pass the time to Taz, I just want to tautoko your mihi to Amohia. I know when we were thinking about it, her name came up immediately in whakauai. You've been mentors to me, and you're always available no matter what, And you've also been generous with your time and your knowledge to other research units. And I know you went around the motu, encouraging people to research and build evidence. And I, it wasn't by chance that I contacted Amohia and I got both of you to be part of it, which was was a blessing. And I'm sure people will what we're going to do, and I've shared on the other webinars, is we recorded this and we're putting them up onto our website, encouraging people who didn't make it to listen and to learn. And at the end of the 6 webinars, we release the the link to the document publication, but we will also send hard copies out to the authors and they can distribute them on our behalf. And we've just been so overwhelmed by the generosity of each of the chapter authors and the deep knowledge that you've got. And I'm very proud of all of you because you've made it so available, and that's I think that's a real criteria for leadership, that you do make yourself available and you make it available for whoever wants it. So mihi atu kia koe Heather, kia kōrua ko Amohia. And I know how busy she is, but she's going to join us next week on the webinar and facilitate that for us. So give her our regards. Okay, now to Kaz. We've had a long history with Kazna and Mokowhiti, Te Ora, when we were Te Matatini, and we've done some work alongside Rangatahi Ora. And so when we saw your name as part of the Te Wai Pounamu o Tautahi, we weren't surprised. We weren't surprised at all. So I welcome you, Kaz, and look forward to what you have to share. We were a bit saddened that Helen wasn't able to join us today, but we have your chapter, and we have her thoughts in there, and I'm sure we're going to have continued contact with you. So I'll hand the time over to you now, Kaz, and to share what you want to share.
Tēnā koe, tēnā tātou katoa, nei rā te mihi mata kuikui ki a koutou katoa. E te rangatira kahu, nei rā te mihi kia koe hoki Heather, tēnā kōrua. I te taho o tōku mama, ko Ngāti Waiwai te hapu, ko Ngāti Hauiti Iwi. I te taho o tōku papa, ko te taiao Māui, ko te rarawa te iwi, ko Kazna Luke tōku ingoa. So I'm really privileged to be in this space and to have the opportunity to share our experiences and over that time. And I need to obviously tender Helen's apologies, our pauarahi, for te Pūtahitanga o Te Wai Pounamu, who isn't able to be with us today. And so I have that privilege and that responsibility to share. It is right to acknowledge, there are acknowledgements to be made, and to be able to have this platform to acknowledge people is that you've created that. It is for Te Ora and Kahu, and to act quickly post the alert and the lockdown to capture the essence of what occurred in many different spaces, and to write that down in those chapters is a real treasure for years to come, but also was a great reflection for the amount of work that was done in that time, then to be able to reflect back on it and see the work that had been done in lots of levels and layers, from whānau, hapu, iwi, it was a real mobilisation of Māori, and that you, Te Ora, have captured that in that document, in that whakaaro is an absolute treasure, and to do it so quickly. So thank you to you and your team and the work that was done over that period. It's a real privilege to be here on today, to be able to share our experiences from Manaaki 20. So how do I get to be here? I was voluntold, to be fair. I'm acting like I had a choice. I really didn't, but I am happy to be in this space. So Mokowhiti is our whānau business. It is our consultancy that I started in 2001. So we are 19 years young and have been working in the whānau development space since our inception. We're a real magnet to that. We have worked alongside Te Wai Ora and workforce development for Kia Ora Hauora about growing our Māori health workforce, which we continue to do. And have worked alongside Te Pūtahitanga o Te Wai Pounamu since its inception, and I had the privilege of being involved in the establishment team. And Te Pūtahitanga o Te Wai Pounamu is a historic collaboration of 9 iwi in Te Wai Pounamu that have come together, and it's founded on the principle of collective impact. And that our iwi came together to develop Te Pūtahitanga, the Whānau Ora South Island Commissioning Agency. And so have had, since its inception, been involved. And then when the alert levels went down, again, what happened right across the nation, there was the mobilisation of Māori in different spaces. And so we were deployed to Te Pūtahitanga from our business as usual, which turned into, as everybody knows, business unusual, and the different speed in which that happened. So that's how I came to be in the Manaaki 20 space, which is the Te Pūtahitanga o Te Wai Pounamu response for COVID-19. And that is really important because we didn't want to call it COVID-19 response. Actually, it was about Manaaki, and that we needed Manaaki for our whānau at this time. It was a time like no other, and we wanted to reframe and change the narrative of the response. And so it was hashtag Manaaki20 was our response that Te Pūtahitanga led out within Te Wai Pounamu. I am going to share a PowerPoint that's more for your safety, so that I stay on track. So it's and it's really important in terms of context. So ko te oranga o te whānau, Te Rau Ora. Te Pūtahitanga is the convergence of the rivers within Te Wai Pounamu, and it is the platform for the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency. Just to set that context in terms of, if we're talking about iwi leadership, this is the iwi that are our taumata for Te Pūtahitanga. It is under their guidance from Ngai Tahu, Ngāti Rārua, Ngāti Tama, Ngāti Koa, Rangitāne ki Wairau, Te Atiawa, Ngāti Apa ki te Rā Toa, Ngāti Kuia, and Ngāti Toa Rangatira, in terms of the response for Te Wai Pounamu. And this is their handsome and beautiful faces, because I think it's really important to put, it is about the people. And so it is for Te Pūtahitanga, it is around our whānau achieving their aspirations, and whatever that looks like. And so, and our purpose is to grow and foster that. And that is our business as usual. And so when COVID came along, what does that look like in the ability to pivot in terms of supporting whānau transformation? This is what, it is the whole other half of New Zealand, Te Wai Pounamu, and so, and it is, we have our 9 iwi, and this is what Te Pūtahitanga's mahi looks like from 1st of July to 30th of June. And in terms of what we do usually with our navigator workforce, in terms of our it started off with 4 navigators, and now with 2 navigators, and now we have 104 that are supporting whānau, and in terms of within Te Wai Pounamu, right from Murihiku to Tākaka, right throughout Te Wai Pounamu, is about mobilising all of those communities and all of that strength and knowledge that was in our communities already, and supporting them. So our navigator support whānau in terms of they are beside our whānau, walk alongside our whānau, and are a tremendous workforce. And so we're on the ground to be mobilised during the COVID experience within our Māori, in the Māori Provider Network. And so they are a huge resource without that could get mobilised straight away. They're building on what they were already doing and have connections in terms of the reach within our whānau. So rely heavily on activating those networks that were already there. And this is obviously, you know, in terms of saying what they do, it's always powerful, the narrative that comes back from our whānau in terms of from their perspective, what the difference that makes. And so what it looks like without the help of the navigator, and that speaks for themselves. They are from our communities, they are in our communities, they whakapapa to our communities, they're a part of it, and they, the work that they do and walking alongside our whānau was what was required at that time. In terms of, that's a context of Te Pūtahitanga in terms of we're manned under the 9 iwi. It is about collective impact, and so in terms of at that time it was really and. So we have 9 iwi in Te Wai Pounamu and Ngāi and all of Ngāti Rā and Ngāti Tama were all doing, activating, mobilising their networks and connecting to their whānau. We connected to the DHB iwi health boards. There was a tremendous amount of information, as Heather said. I found myself nodding continuously and understanding that, because it's not unique, that is what happened, and that's leadership in action. And also the amount of information was dizzying in terms of what was coming out and on lots of layers at a DHB and the iwi health, and so this was about that we have the mana, actually we have the resources, we have it in our whānau to mobilise. And what was really revealed was, you know, as what happens when whānau collectivise, and that we can do and have remarkable outcomes for our whānau. COVID itself was a powerful example of, for the first time in a contemporary history, a Māori history, that we have achieved better outcomes than non-Māori, bucking the forecast that Māori would have multiple times the infection rate of non-Māori by having a low, disproportionately low rate. So it was, and I think that's really important, that we achieved the better health outcomes in this time when it was predicted. And if you looked at all the vulnerability indicators, we were disproportionately represented in those, yet we had a low infection rate that wasn't. So I think that's a real, it is a real sign in terms of what was done, and in terms of that is the best outcome that we could have. So we have the mana manaki 20 was really reframing it, as I spoke earlier, and taking it away from COVID-19. And actually it is about, at this time, our whānau, we need manaki and all sorts of expressions for manaki to get through this. And so that underpinned the response that we did. And in terms of what did we do? This is, we did things that we'd never done before, because that's what was required. Everybody pivoted, and we mobilised supports right across Te Wai Pounamu that didn't exist before 23rd of March, because that's what was required. And in terms of, at that time, we reached out to whānau directly and asked them what were their needs, and how can we best respond to that, as opposed to thinking, well, this is what we should do. So over that period, we had over 4,202 surveys completed from whānau, representing 18,204 whānaus within that whare. And so we reached out to them directly and asked them Have they returned from overseas? Are you on medications? Do you have enough meds? Have you had the flu vaccination? And so it was really to connect with our whānau and see how best that we could serve them at this time and what were their priority and needs. And so this is, and what was really telling in that, in terms of having access to Kai over the next 4 weeks, hygiene products and data and internet, and how they're confident. So this is what rose from that. What we've learned in this period is obviously we connected with our whānau during this time, and we're able to respond based on what they needed. So it was really good to know this, but what did we do? What did that look like? So now that we know this, what did we do with that? And so we set up those supports and mobilise those supports. And it's really important to note that this was in addition. Iwi did their response as well. It was all in that time. What we experienced was an and for our whānau, that there were layers that were occurring and that we were contributing to that. But in terms of directly supporting those whānau that came in with what they needed, over that time, to over 2,500 Kai supports for whānau, data support and power. Those were the needs. What we realised, and speaking directly with whānau, was that they were struggling before lockdown, and so the lockdown actually amplified that stress for whānau. And so we were able to mobilise these supports which come to us, and it was our role to get out in conjunction and liaising with iwi, because they were doing their supports to their tribal members as well. And so this is a snapshot of, in what we did, and it's really important. It was great to have, this is an example in terms of the infographics around data and evidence. It's like, how much do we do? And is really powerful leverage in terms of being accountable for our whānau, and saying this is how much and how often. And but what rose was our whānau narratives and their stories and their experiences, by connecting with them and giving them a space to express themselves. So as an example, over 4,000 undertook the survey, 4,202, but the supports were only needed for 2,870 of our whānau. So there were some that did it, and they were wanting to help others and to connect. It wasn't that, and some of the calls were about just listening and having those supports and those connections and mobilising that reach. And it was a response like no other. So for Te Wai Pounamu, we have had earthquakes, we have had terrorist attacks, and so we've had our fair share of emergencies, but this was like a response no other, because you had to stay home. Normally our quick responses, get the van, let's go, and be there. We were wanting to keep everybody at home and mobilise supports in different ways. So pivoting and using social media was the priority at that time. We have to acknowledge our response was derived and shared by Waikato Tainui. It was uplift and inform and prepare were the three areas that we looked at that we could serve whānau, and Waikato at Tainui shared their COVID response plan with us so that we could do that quickly. And it was all of that collaboration, that leadership and action, and that sharing and mobilising of information that enabled, that I think occurred at that time and made a significant difference for whānau. And so also it was an opportunity. We had daily shows. Social media was a huge medium that were making connections with whānau. So It was about having uplifting content in a time when there was stress and anxiety, and asking whānau, because the levels went up, and so that was a really good way to connect. We had a daily show each morning that Rocky led out that was able to communicate what was happening in each of the communities. Yeah, it is trying to, it would be, what didn't we do? Because we did as much as we could, because that's what was required at that time, if we think about it, and being able to reflect on that is, now we look back at it and it's like, oh, but it was what was needed. It was really what was required to support our whānau at that time. And I think in terms of our response, we've had the opportunity to go back out to whānau and ask them what their experiences were. And I think, I'm going to read out some of their responses, because I think that that's, me saying it is one thing, but actually coming from our whānau and what their experience is much more meaningful, actually. The lady was kind. It was such a blessing in an uncertain time. I did not feel judged and was so thankful for the support I was given. It not only helped me as an individual, but my whole family. We were going through an extremely rough time due to illness. Everyone I spoke to were awesome, and I didn't feel whakamā. We received a response from them and they were absolutely amazing. I cried. I've never been treated so nicely. And I could keep going. There are, in terms of those, but I think that they are really powerful. And it wasn't what you do and what happened at that time. It was with kindness, and how that makes a difference in such stressful times that and we are going through it together. We are in it together, but that it made a difference, and that there was someone that we could respond to. We would ask, how did you find out about the survey, and how did you, get connected? And we heard many, and it was that, the mobilisation of the whakawhanaungatanga, my neighbour, my whānau, my mum, my auntie said, it really just flourished in that time. One that came to me was my bus driver. My bus driver said to me, had you heard about this? And he said, you need support. And so it came from all, it came right from our communities, that in terms of that response. So there were lots of pivoting and doing things online that hadn't been done before. The sort of innovation and the reach for our Māori businesses and whānau, the innovation was amazing. And those role models that we had, and we had plenty. There was also the 25,000 hygiene packs that went throughout Te Wai Pounamu, all just lots of different contributions. And I agree, Heather, the volunteer capacity and people working above and beyond was really evident in terms of, the response. Everybody did what needed to be done. But it was about trying to uplift as well during this time, and those connections. So together we will get through kindness. Yeah. So that's a part of what we did, and in that time it was Zoom, the Zoom fatigue, and just everything just was really intense, because it needed to be. We hadn't been through anything like this. But from my experience, what I saw was leadership in action, and really, and leadership, decisive leadership that needed to occur quickly, and decisions to be made quickly, that we don't have that luxury. The actual virus spread faster than, the ability in terms of making some decisions. So you needed to make them quickly. and just doing what needed to be done. And I've consistently said that, but the power of that to make a difference is the impact that it has, and impacting the way that we will do things. It was drawing on what we've how we previously worked in our pre-COVID. I think witnessing tikanga evolving and some really hard decisions, and seeing that and within our leaders making those decisions was really empowering and inspiring. And lots of us did what was beyond what we thought we could do because of the leadership, and we were inspired by it. And so you would go above and beyond because that's what you saw, and you saw it everywhere. And I think in every Zoom that you looked at, those were the faces that were making a difference in lots of different spaces. But at the end, it made an impact in terms of our outcomes, and you know that it being contained at that time for Māori. It was a real privilege to be involved and to be part of it. I just, yeah, it's lovely talking about it now. And at the time, I didn't think I could have fond memories of it because it was the intensity. But it was an intelligent, it was an accelerated response because it needed to be. And it was done with real kindness and the opportunity to make a difference for whānau. That's what I felt, that's what I witnessed, that's why I am part of it and will continue to be a part of it. And that's really Whānau Ora in action in a time of real stress and extreme, in a time like we've had no other. Yeah, I wish Helen was here to talk to it, but it's a lovely opportunity for me to thank her in terms of her leadership over that time, and we rose beyond whatever we thought that we could do, and it was under the leadership of Helen in terms of as a pauarahi for Te Pūtahitanga. And of all the iwi, I'm immensely proud. I obviously whakapapa to Ngāi Tahu and to the far north. I've intelligently married into Te Tauihu for Ngāti Rā, and so and have deep whakapapa connects, and I'm deeply proud of the response that I witnessed and I saw from throughout the rohe. And that, you know, that we have the capacity and capability, and that's what was demonstrated in that time. We rose and shined, and that's, we've been doing that, and it was in a time like no other. And so thank you for the opportunity. I'm aware of the time to speak on our small contribution, and it's everybody's contribution that made the difference at that time, and was a real privilege to be involved. So nei rā te mihi kia koutou.
Tēnā koe.
Yeah.
Tēnā koe. Before we close, I'll make a couple of comments. I read your chapter, and in it was the acknowledgement of Easter, and that our children wouldn't miss out because you were going to make sure you collected all the eggs, chocolate eggs you could, Kaz, and make sure they got them. And then a couple of days later, our Prime Minister makes a statement, the Easter Bunny is an essential worker. And I thought, oh, how appropriate that it could come out after I read that in your chapter. There are similarities, I think, that what I liked about both of your chapters is that you highlighted the collection, how important the collection of data is, so that you had it at your fingertips. And I acknowledge that, all the work that you've done in Te Wai Pounamu, and also through Ngāti Hauiti and the Iwi Forum, through Dr. Amohia Bolton's role as the technical expert to Iwi leaders to that forum around data. So those were really important to me, and I got really excited to see all of that, and all the infographics that came through and the mention of that, because it's our evidence. It tells us and it tells others, this is what we did, this is what we achieved, and the framework that that the iwi are expecting, absolutely. So I want to thank you for giving us those because we've got a lot of qualitative, but yours particularly gave us the inclination for quantitative and collecting that. So mihi atu. I'm just going to close it with a he ya te me anui, te wao-nui-o-tane a. Maku e ki atu, he tangata. Muhi atu ki a koutou, Ngāti Hauiti Te Wai Pounamu, o tō koutou tākoha ki te ao. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou. Oi.